Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 820, August the 24th, 1987. I didn't get a chance to talk about Rudolf Hess last week. He's a controversial person who died at the late age of 93, and even in death there was the mystery about why he was left alone when he was usually watched. Of course, it was on an American Guard duty, why the cord was left around that was supposed to have strangled him. His family didn't believe he committed suicide. They thought maybe he was drugged. And I've done quite a few broadcasts on Rudolf Hess through the years. I have many books, quite a few on him, and books about him in the course of Nazi history. The interesting ones about him that I have, one is titled Motive for a Mission, the story behind Hess's flight to Britain. It was written by James Douglas Hamilton, and it was on his property, on his father's estate in Scotland, that Rudolf Hess landed. And it's a very interesting explanation of Hess's activities. Another controversial book came out in 1984, The Murder of Rudolf Hess by W.U. Thomas, who claims that the wounds and the ribs on Rudolf Hess at Spandau Prison are not identical to those that Rudolf Hess had in World War I injuries. Another controversial book, written somewhat as a novel, but suggestions of what would have happened or what did happen to Hess, is called The Hess Cross by James Stewart Thayer. And on the cover of the book it said only the Reich's most evil genius could mastermind this plan. And it's about a study, an objective study of the mastermind and Rudolf Hess's role in 1942 of American and German scientists working on atomic bombs, and how he was flown to the United States and betrayed the United States and was working with a blind allegiance for the Third Reich. Another book by James Leeser, The Uninvited Envoy, published by McGraw-Hill in 1962. Bernard Hutton wrote a book for Macmillan in 1970, Hess, the Man and His Mission. And by far the most interesting book on Hess is called The Case of Rudolf Hess, A Problem in Diagnosis and Forensic Psychiatry, and it's edited by John Rawlings Rees of the Tavistock Clinic in London. Now that is the headquarters for British intelligence and then American intelligence for the mind control programs, which we took over after World War II, and systematically we're testing electric shock, erasing minds, the acid test, psychosurgery, and so forth. And John Rawlings Rees was in charge of Rudolf Hess, along with other psychiatrists and physicians who saw him from 1941 to 46. But this is the time period where the double could be created. A man could create the name, use the name Rudolf Hess, and believe he is a Rudolf Hess. And there are other famous doubles I've studied, such as the one of Howard Hughes and Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Hess one was a perfectly good one to test on this particular person and let him be released for other things that he went about with the goal of the Third and Fourth Reich to continue for Adolf Hitler. There are many people in London, the Cliveden set, and so forth in Britain that were very sympathetic to Adolf Hitler and to the mission of Rudolf Hess. After Hess got out of this mind control clinic after 1946 and was sent to Germany, he didn't see any member of his family for 20 years. And he never touched a member of his family after that, and he saw them about 15 minutes once a month, alternating, no records kept and nothing written down, and everything he wrote was destroyed, and now Spandau will be taken apart stone by stone, and there will be no actual proof that that was Hess in the prison at Spandau from 1946. But as I say, I've done a lot on that in the past, and maybe we'll detail some of it later. It's a very interesting story. You all read, I'm sure, that Fawn Hall signed a contract with the talent agency, the William Morris Agency, with Norman Brokow, and they're going to develop her talents based upon the fame she achieved during the coverage of the Iran-Contra hearings. And William Morris Agency is the same agency that employed Marvin Pancoast as not as a star, but as a courier, the man who later would crack open Vicky Morgan's skull and keep silence forever the relationship of her lover, Alfred Bloomingdale, to Ronald Reagan and to the cabinet of Ronald Reagan. The William Morris Agency also represents Ronald Reagan, and just this past weekend, There's an article in the parade section of the various newspapers that William Morris Agency will be glad to have Ronald Reagan at age 78 when he retires. They are the agency that represents Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission and his wife Betty, Dr. Armand Hammer, the head of Occidental Petroleum, ex-Secretary of State Alexander Haig, and so forth. This is the agency that has the multi-million-dollar books for these people who leave office or who are infamous in office, and the contractors there are saying Reagan is worth millions of dollars. Anywhere they want him, he would be wanted in a moment. But it's interesting, the same agency that represents Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan for the books that they will write in the future represents Fawn Hall, the very lady who destroyed the papers that might have Ronald Reagan in prison instead of being the superstar that he is. So a payoff for Fawn Hall very easily is to get her a contract with the agent that represents him. Just as Ronald Reagan said on the telephone to Oliver North, this will make a great movie, which means translated into millions of dollars, one way or the other. The case of Mordecai VANUNU opens up August 30th, this next week. A small article in the LA Times and San Francisco Chronicle titled "Spy Case Defendant Wants His Trial Open." It's going to be a secret trial, and Mordecai VANUNU has been charged with passing along the evidence of nuclear secrets to a London newspaper, not so much the secrets, but where Israelis' atomic bombs are. And of course, the London Times mentioned the neutron bomb too in Israel, and it's my contention that they tested the neutron bomb in Cameroon. The very right-wing Spotlight paper, Liberty Lobby, has been coming out with articles such as those, a huge one on VANUNU, on Edwin Wilson. Victor Marchetti is writing for them. Fletcher Prouty is writing for them. Mark Lane is their attorney. And while Willie Carto is so far right, the editor of this particular paper, he's using the information and passing along information about things that are conspiratorial that the other newspapers don't carry. So his issue number 34, August 24th, has a large article. The CIA helped to kidnap VANUNU in a joint operation with the Mossad. And it's about this woman from the CIA who assisted him her name is Cindy, in getting kidnapped in Rome and then taken, put in the bottom of an airplane and drugged and taken to Israel, where he isn't seen, and he was knocked out by the Mossad operatives. And his trial, as I said, begins this week. And this article, in Spotlight also says that the Spotlight learned that Shimon Peres, Israel's prime minister at the time, took personal charge of VANUNU's kidnapping and helped prepare the ground for it. And it was Shimon Peres who flew to Cameroon the exact same time as the neutron bomb was going off and was entertained there, and flew in with a team of approximately 17 doctors. And I believe that Israel was testing it for the United States. And it was VANUNU who leaked the word out about the neutron bomb. And that was shortly after the Cameroon explosion that has still never really been resolved. I want to do more later, not this evening, on a brief mention in New Republic about Ollie North and the Spitz Chanell offices. And somebody sent me this article. I want to thank you for it. And it has to do with Spitz Chanell using the autograph pen of Ronald Reagan for the auto pen for asking for money for raising for the GOP or for the Contras. And in the process of describing Spitz Chanell's auto pen and work with Ronald Reagan, this author, whose name is, I don't know if any of you know him, Mark Hosenball, Hosenball, he said, by late last year, Spitz Chanell was using Ronald Reagan's name and signature to raise funds for projects other than the Contras. According to two former associates, in late 1986, Chanell began to make trips to Europe to raise money for Western goals, a crackpot group founded by the late Representative Larry McDonald that Spitz Chanell took over last summer. The pigeons this time were wealthy German widows and deposed continental royalty. The causes were an eternal flame at the Berlin Wall, apparently to be called the Peace Torch, and a U.S. television advertising campaign where Europe would thank America for their democratic values. the German donors, at least one potential German donor, was not fooled, and the article goes on about the German donors. Now, it's interesting that the organization Western Goals is using deposed Continental royalty for funds for Western Goals, and where this particular writer, Mark Hosenball, gets the idea that Western Goals is some kind of what he calls a crackpot group, I suggest he look again at the board of directors that I've had on the air many times, just to cite a few. Edward Teller, the head of the Star War programs; Admiral Thomas Moore, the former Joint Chief of Staff; General John Singlaub, the hub of the entire Iran-Contra affair; and General George Patton III, the son of George Patton, the one who is so pro-Nazi with those German monarchists, and the father George Patton is the prototype that Ollie North loved. His father fought with George Patton, and I want to do more on George Patton later. But this is the way these very serious connections to the German monarchy, the deposed monarchy, who would like their thrones back, and also the wealthy Germans, widows such as Mrs. Garwood, pump money into Western Goals. They've always had offices in Germany, as well as having their $100,000 computer in Los Angeles to take the names of law-abiding citizens into their computer. But this is the way these very serious matters are treated, tongue-in-cheek, so that you don't take seriously Western Goals if the name should ever be in a national publication. This past week, there was an article in the LA Times that Edwin Wilson is meeting with the Iran-Contra investigators, discussing his relationship with Erich von Marburg, Thomas Kleins, and General Secord in a company called EATSCO, E-A-T-S-C-O. I've talked about that before, the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company, and so the Iran-Contra people are seeing him. He asked to be heard. Daniel Sheehan is traveling on the West Coast in this next week, a week from today, and up through the coast. He will be in Monterey, Carmel, Monterey, at the New Forum Luncheon at the Sheraton Hotel this coming Monday and on the 31st, and then there will be a reception for him, and then there will be a lot of gatherings and fundraisings for the Christic Institute. In case you can still get here for the occasion next Monday, the lunch is going to be at the Sheraton Hotel. It's $13. You can get a reservation to the New Forum. Call the New Forum 625-9967 and see about sending in your reservation. I also want to mention that when Danny Sheehan was on the Larry King show, he was with a man named George Carver. I referred to him last week as working under the Olin Foundation money, Olin Foundation having also funded Albert Hakim. But George Carver appeared again this week as a guest again on Crossfire with Tom Braden and Robert Novak. And the other person in the chair is Jonathan Whitney, who's written a new book on the intelligence community and the murders in the CIA and the drug connections. Carver was on CNN Larry King with Danny Sheehan. Now Carver was with Jonathan Whitney, and he seems to be the person to represent the interests of the intelligence community if somebody opposing that position of defense is taking apart the intelligence community. There is a publication that I haven't been aware of before. They sent me one issue, and I'm going to order more of them, and I want to give you their address because they have a very, very good, long, detailed account written by Daniel Sheehan of the people behind the suit that he is representing, the defendants, and the story of how they came to be and how they came together. It's a very definitive account, and it's interesting. The publication is called The Underground Forest, 21 Forest Avenue, Portland, Maine, 04101. Ask for Volume 4, Number 2, Spring 1987. It's $3. Written by Daniel Sheehan, a very, very good account of what the group is doing. Also, I read that in St. Paul, Minnesota, there is a group of people that have started a Contragate Watch, which is very important, of combining concerned people to keep an update of the suit of Christic Institute and of what the government is doing from this point on, given all the cover-ups that we've seen and all the exposés of the hidden teams. This article comes out of the People's Daily World. It says, Contragate Watch of Minnesota has been formed to help alert people here to the threat to democracy revealed by the Iran-Contra scandal, and to develop support for the lawsuit filed by Washington-based Christic Institute. Over 60 national organizations, including the Methodist Board of Global Congregations, Now, Sane, the Freeze, have joined the Communications Alliance in support of the Christic Institute's Iran-Contra investigation and lawsuit. And this article says that these various people have banded together, and the group here is a spin-off of Women Against Military Madness, and they became active several months ago. And the Contra Watch is utilizing a videotape made by Daniel Sheehan, and they will update at their meetings whenever they are and keep showing the tape or make it available. And they are going to help support this trial. The preparations of the trial are costing $40,000 a week. And this is a very good way for people in each local community to find those so-called concerned, or they are not so-called, the concerned persons, and form groups and committees and put the differences aside and keep track of how the suit develops, what happens to the defendants or the plaintiffs, and alert various members of Congress of what's going on in the newspaper media, because this is the most interesting suit that has come along, as I say, since Jim Garrison arrested or had the trial of Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw got off because the conspiracy charges were sabotaged from every end and angle. But in this case, Danny Sheehan has time in his favor where people can think conspiratorially and they can see documents where the government acts conspiratorially. So it's to his advantage and our advantage to get in now into this, the ability to get together in groups and study what is going on in Washington and put your energies to support this psychologically and financially. Along the lines of what the Christic Institute is trying to show, illustrate, I have in my files many articles going back quite a few years, and I just pulled out one concerning drug connections. This came out June 20th, 1975. And as you follow the Christic Institute suit and the affidavits from 1959 up to the present, you can put this particular news into the time slot of 1975. The article says Canadian Parliament member Derek Blackburn says he believes that the government of the United States and Canada have set up an escape route for South Vietnamese refugees who could be embarrassing to the United States. Blackburn made his statement amid a growing controversy over the quiet admission into Canada last month of a high-ranking official of the former Thieu administration who was allegedly involved in heroin traffic. Blackburn received an affidavit from former Saigon U.S. Embassy aide Stephen Young, confirming widespread charges that General Dang Van Quang was a high-ranking official in Saigon and he had been involved in heroin traffic, black market dealing, and war profiteering. Now, the CIA official in Saigon at that time, or around that time, just a few years previously, and then he turned over to Thomas Polgar, was Theodore Shackley, who is a defendant in the Christic Institute and is also named by Kung Sa, the Burmese drug lord. So out of Saigon, there was black marketing, war profiting, and heroin trafficking. Blackburn said he also asked the United States and Canada officials about the Quang affair, but that he never received an answer. Blackburn says he detected that Quang had entered Canada along with a highly organized escape route, which he detected had been set up for these refugees who could be politically embarrassing to the United States, which translated means we had to give them safety or they would blackmail us. Blackburn says Quang would be a terrible embarrassment to the CIA, for example, because he worked closely with the agency in South Vietnam and in Saigon in the heroin traffic. He is safe in Canada, of course. Quang cannot be subpoenaed to be a witness at any congressional hearing. Blackburn said there is only one case he knows of in which a refugee who applied for immigration to Canada was denied admission. That is General Nguyen, Nguyen Van Nong, who is now at Camp Pendleton, working where our Marines are, at Camp Pendleton. Nong, Blackburn said, was denied admission to Canada because he apparently let it be known that he was going to blow the lid off some of the past activities of former high-ranking South Vietnamese generals who are now in Canada. that involving the CIA and the narcotics traffic. So I think that is a point that has been written up in many, many books. It appears in many articles, and it should be recognized as a fact that our government, just as they worked with top Nazi war persons who were criminals from 1943 until 1945 and helped with the rat line, helped them get out of Europe and helped to white out the resistance in Europe, we also brought the heroin traffickers to the United States after the war and to Canada, where they could continue also the narcotics from Southeast Asia keep pouring in. Now, there was a lot of talk during the hearings and through the evidence of a junta or a secret team of the president and the National Security Council, of the president being left out of plans. And I'm going to go into detail that is complicated for some of you. Not many of you listen every single week. Those of you who do will follow my train of thought. But there are a lot of items in the news now, and I'm going to give you sort of a Rorschach. Just throw them out in chronological order. But there are a lot of things I'm seeing happen that indicate that the junta, the fight between the NSC, the National Security Council, and the President and the Congress is stronger than ever. There is a mean battle that is churning there right now in Washington, the exact same type of battle that I described in the weeks prior to when Ronald Reagan was shot in March of 1981. Up to the evening before he was shot, I was detailing the conflicts of fights of George Bush and Alexander Haig and George Shultz, and there was a bitter fight of the NSC staff and the persons running the White House between each other about who was going to get the turf. The past week there were two cartoons about Ronald Reagan, one this morning and one several days ago. This morning's August 24th in the Chronicle. It's by Danziger of the Christian Science Monitor. 4 pictures of Reagan, one holding a rifle with a sweatshirt, "I am a Contra," with the helmet. The next one, "I am a Contra," and the shirt's being torn off and the gun's being torn off. And then Reagan is sitting down confused, and somebody is holding him dark glasses and a beard. And then all of a sudden he's singing with the dark glasses and the beard, "The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind." And then the shirt says, "Us out of Nicaragua," and the guitar says, "Love," and he takes on the role of Bob Dylan. The role, of course, you get the message from the toughie to the softy. And then there's another one of him in the paper today, "Summer of Love." Ronald Reagan is holding his fingers in the V. "Give peace a shot," and there's another Sandinista, Ortega, and Ronald Reagan is making the peace overture. He has a daisy in his hair and little tight lips, as if he has changed character. And the change of character is what the fight is about in Washington. And of course, it is a very serious fight, and I believe that Ronald Reagan got a serious message or warning. And I want to take the newspaper articles simultaneously, just the past couple of weeks, as I saw them, and certain messages in the paper and pictures in the paper that were there just before Reagan was shot in March. And a while back, around that time, I did a broadcast on the message of the bombing of Pearl Harbor that was read through newspaper articles and New Yorker ads that were placed, that somebody put this together and found a man who had pre-knowledge of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the message was in the printed page. But this isn't that subtle, and I want to share some dates with you. July 29th, the New York Times had a front page story, "Leading aviation groups agree on a plan for safer, faster flights." We've had a lot of trouble with airplanes. The next day, July 30th, the New York Times has a long picture with letters over the top. "Cowboy wasn't lonesome in death." It was Ronald and Nancy sitting at the funeral of Commerce Secretary Malcolm Baldrige, but the cowboy was a reference also used March, just before Reagan was shot, along with some other words, and the picture of him with Nancy looking mournful. "Cowboy wasn't lonesome" reminded me of that other reference of the cowboy. The same day, July 30th, the LA Times, "Donald Nixon, brother of ex-president, dies." And it describes at the height of Watergate, there was a wiretap that Richard Nixon put on his brother. There were fears involved with financial deals. A $205,000 loan was once given to Donald Nixon by the used tool company to avoid bankruptcy. It became a campaign issue, and then in 1969, Donald's business deals went sour. He had some problems, and then he started dining in that time period with officials of the Greek military junta and got VIP treatment. The CIA had put in the Greek military junta in 1967, and Donald was with them. He was traveling to the Dominican Republic with John Meyer, a very controversial person who worked for the youth organization. Robert Mayhew fired John Meyer in 1969 when Richard Nixon told him to. He wanted him separated from Donald Nixon. Now, the news continues, and it was Donald Nixon, the one who died. It's his son who is to meet Mr. Harlan Jones at the airport in Orange County at the John Wayne Airport around the 14th of August. They're to meet there. It's the son of this man who just passed away on the 30th, very much part of the Reagan, Mayhew, Howard Hughes organization throughout all of Nixon's career. August the 5th, the White House cautiously unveils, this is the New York Times, cautiously unveils a peace plan for Central America. A new Central America peace plan could end foreign support for both Nicaragua government and rebels. The reaction from the Contra leaders was strongly negative. Nicaragua peace plan is floated. The Washington Post has their lead story, August the 5th. White House seeks ceasefire. The Reagan administration presented to congressional leaders a new peace plan for both Nicaragua government and rebels. That is in the New York Times, August the 5th. And also August the 5th, the Washington Post, alongside that article, says jet private plane clips each other, and it's about a commuter plane clipping in California. The tail section of one was hit. Leading articles about aviation problems and tails planes in near misses. Now, August the 6th, the Republicans responded, the far right, to Reagan's peace feeler the day before. Houston Post story, Contra plan upsets Texas Republicans. Miami Herald, U.S. proposes a peace plan. Aid to Congress would stop under U.S. ceasefire proposals. Now, on the Nixon side, L.A. Times, August the 7th, Richard Nixon is writing an article titled A Clever Satire That Hits Close to Home. It's really a lot about nothing, but the purpose of getting Nixon as a columnist in the newspapers is interesting at this time. His brother has died. Mr. Jones is going to meet Nixon's nephew, and another person close to Richard Nixon died at that time, involved with Howard Mayhew, the Howard Hughes cash money, and the organization from the Hughes people. Richard Danner was a high official in the Las Vegas hotel, the Sands Hotel. He's the manager who gave Howard Hughes cash to Richard Nixon. He said he delivered $50,000 two different times to the Nixon career. He also helped manage the Sands Hotel of Howard Hughes. Richard Nixon's brother died just a few weeks before Richard Danner died. Both of them were on in years. It's okay, I don't believe they were murdered, but it's a coincidence. Danner, who was a conduit of funds from Howard Hughes' money to the re-election campaign of Nixon, and as a former FBI man, it's interesting how he helped deliver cash to Bibi Rabosa. There would be election money for Richard Nixon. The contributions of the John Mitchell, the money went to John Mitchell, the Attorney General, the contributions from the Hughes money, and then John Mitchell approved, as Attorney General, the acquisition of Howard Hughes to get the hotel, the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. There was a limit on how many hotels one person could own, and the Attorney General said go ahead and do that after a lot of cash was delivered to the man who made him the Attorney General. Now, in addition to the conservatives being upset, Alfonso Sciardi had an article in the Miami Herald, this is August the 7th, that also is in the San Jose Mercury on the West Coast. It was mentioned by Mr. Wayrick on CNN on Crossfire that day, talking about what in the world has gotten into Ronald Reagan's head. Why is he changing his mind about what is going on in Central America? We thought we had the initiative with Ollie North, and all of a sudden he opens up this peace feeler. The article by Alfonso Sciardi is titled Nicaragua Talks. the First Lady steered Ronald Reagan to the peace plan. And this is a quotation of Jim Wright, who said that First Lady Nancy Reagan wanted to boost the peace plan. And on Crossfire, the WRIGHT said it was because she wanted Reagan to have the Nobel Peace Prize. We'll take a 1-minute break and go on to this milieu in the White House that is getting very scary and tight at the present time. And I think we should observe it in spite of all the other more exciting things that are in the news, study some of these details. This is Mae Brussell. It is side 2 of World Watchers, program number 820, and I'm talking about a fight going on in the White House with the president, the conservatives, with Nancy Reagan, and what the consequences might possibly be. And I'm also believing that that plane that didn't hit Ronald Reagan but went close enough to him was a message. Many of you have seen the movie The Godfather, and the person they're trying to scare, they didn't kill him, but they cut the horse's head off and put it in bed with him. And I believe the circumstances of the people on that plane and where they were going and who they were, timed at this particular moment, are to give Ronald Reagan a message that he better steer back, or he's going to be like another president. He remembers that situation. I think they want to gear him on course and keep him in power, the remaining of this administration, but not sidetrack some way that his wife might want him to be. Now, the article by Alfonso Sciardi goes into the point out that the First Lady helped boost this idea, and he said Nancy is convinced her husband needed to leave office to be remembered as the man who made peace. Well, there are several things she doesn't want to be remembered as, and these are terribly important. She doesn't want him to be remembered as the man who armed Khomeini, the evil person who was spreading so much terror in the Middle East, arming Iran. She doesn't want him to be remembered as the man who was arming the Contras to the hilt after he learns about the massive drug traffic, because he gave her a project these years to just say no and stop drugs. And it is the 25 or 30 major drug articles that I collected in the last several weeks that indicate there was no other route for Reagan now that he knows. He always knew, but as this material comes out about the drug traffic, you can't keep supporting the Contras and let the drug evidence and hearings go on in the Senate and the House, on public television, in court cases, and so forth. And so she's steering him to a moment where he would remember it for the peace. And also the third thing is the Spitz Chanell office has been linked through many, many articles, and in the New Republic recently, and in other areas, with the homosexual ring of Spitz Chanell and the people that were raising money for the Contras. And that is another area where the very staunch conservatives don't appreciate the arms of Khomeini, the drug traffic exposés coming out, and the homosexual relationships. So they're between a rock and a hard place. If anything is to be remembered, it's going to have to be some peace initiative now, but the powers that be are not going to let that happen, and the indications are that this tug of war is very strong. Alfonso Sciardi said Nancy talked to the president. She was insisting, she was urgent, and she is 150% supporting of the peace project, but the initiative belongs to the president. The president said, and she said that the very decision belongs to him, not to her. Thomas Loeffler, who was brought into the White House during the Iran-Contra hearings, is the chief lobbyist for the Contras, an aide to the president, and he was put in touch with Jim Wright 2 weeks ago, which would be July 24th. Now, July 24th was several weeks, 2 weeks exactly, before Mr. Myers checks out AWOL out of the U.S. Army, and he's back in the Army now, and has that little flight over in Santa Barbara that we'll get back to later. But this sending Tom Loeffler from Texas to Jim Wright set in motion, the Miami Herald said, the process. Jim Wright said that Howard Baker, Secretary of State, George Shultz, and NSC Frank Carlucci collaborated in assembling the plan together. Elliot Abrams was not included because he wouldn't want it. Wright said that Loeffler, who was a longtime friend of his from Texas, an ex-legislative colleague, came to his office, to the Speaker of the House of the Democratic Party, and said that President Reagan has, this quotes, has no credibility on Capitol Hill because of the Iran-Contra scandal. Now the White House is ready to compromise and forge a new bipartisan policy with the Democrats. Loeffler said the administration was now ready to change policy and adopt a posture of flexibility and realism. Howard Baker is redefining the policy. Now that is between Howard Baker, the president, and Jim Wright, and Mr. Loeffler was the middleman between that. Just as this is going on, August the 7th, Miami Herald has a story, no direct talks with Managua. Reagan assured the Contras several days, 2 days after his speech, I won't talk to them, the Contras. On August the 7th, the same day, Daniel Ortega chided Reagan and insisted, if you want what you say you want, we'll have direct talks. And that same day, Miami Herald had a story, peace plan has a too familiar ring, the timing is hard to ignore, and it questions what is Reagan really about. And following the peace plan, our special envoy to Latin America, Reagan's envoy, Mr. Habib, Mr. Philip Habib, quit. He rejected what Ronald Reagan's team were doing actually behind his back. He was excluded from the hearings. He's wanted all along a negotiated peace, not a military action in Central America, and he is getting out of the policies, and he cleared his office out of the State Department. Then he announced he was leaving, and he was angered by being excluded from the negotiations between Jim Wright and George Shultz and Howard Baker. And once they put it all together, they said Habib would be the man to do the job, but he wasn't included in the issues. August the 9th, the LA Times had an article, Contra issue spurs bitter U.S. battle. And this article was also in the Miami Herald by Alfonso Shardi, titled headlines, Administration is engaged in a bitter squabble over the Contras. Neither Contras or their most ardent supporters were allowed to participate in the 10-day secret talk of Jim Wright and Howard Baker. Elliot Abrams was excluded. Abrams' forces are fighting hard. The next day, August the 9th, Reagan supports peace agreement by 5 Latin leaders. Dale Bumpers, New York Times, Reagan's plan is worth studying. I rephrased the headline. Reagan's Nicaragua plan is worth studying. The next day, August the 10th, Miami Herald, Nixon's old neighbor forgets his historic date, and it reminds people that on August the 9th, Richard Nixon left office, and there's an article, Richard Nixon's date of August 9th will live forever. Nixon bid the nation farewell 13 years ago, and Nixon not only is writing a column, Nixon is written about when he leaves office, Nixon's brother dies, Nixon's nephew is at the airport, and of course we know what Watergate meant to Richard Nixon's administration. Now the fight in Washington was going on. The Washington Times, Reverend Moon's paper, had the biggest banners, Contra backers prod the president to fight for aid. December the 11th, Gene Kirkpatrick joins the critics on Reagan's Nicaragua plan. On his move, Jack Kemp was against him. George Bush went to Miami and told the Contras, we will not let you twist in the wind. And front page article, LA Herald, again, on the left-hand side, several days in a row, fear of flying at new heights about airplane problems. Now, August the 11th was a key day. There was a long article in the Wall Street Journal titled Reagan's Bay of Pigs that I referred to before. And I want to share that with you because it spells out that what Ronald Reagan is doing is literally his undoing. And then the next day, there's an article by Adolfo Calero that we weren't included in the plans, and Adolfo Calero is complaining that he wasn't considered in making the decisions about this matter, and I want to share that article with you. And also, the Wall Street Journal had an article then, a long one, battling back, visibly aged and hurt by hearings. Reagan tries hard to rebound, but he's slipping into impotence. And so there's the Bay of Pigs, which is a code word for people who studied the Kennedy assassination, when Richard Nixon said this goes back to the Bay of Pigs, and an article about his impotence. And then the articles, I'm going to share those two with you, but October the 12th, there were 4 or 5 major articles, one in the Chronicle, Weinberger wraps Nicaragua peace plan. The Washington Times, the Reagan disillusion continues. After Iran-Contra, Reagan is scuttling some of the covert capacities, and this is an article complaining that his rules for the covert action will thoroughly bureaucratize covert missions, which are supposed to pass bureaucracy and go beyond it. Washington Times Jack Kemp again scores Reagan on central policy. August the 12th again, Washington Times Jeremiah O'Leary, tasked now to restore Reagan's faded luster. And then a Washington Times article, August the 12th, Southern senators meet with Reagan about Americans' plans. But the next day, Ronald Reagan gives his speech to the nation. This is a August 13th speech where he's to talk about Iran-Contra. And on the front page of the LA Herald, it says, Reagan takes the fall guy role, admits he was too stubborn on policy. And in big black letters, it says, I had the right, the obligation to make my own decisions. Now, when Reagan gave this speech, that I have the right to make my own decisions, this was August the 13th, he already had Mr. Loeffler and Howard Baker working from July 22nd on the decision about the Central American policy. He had the chief of staff and his advisor would be helping the Contras, making the decision to work out a plan that he would present, and he did present on August the 5th, and he defended it on the 13th, saying, I had the right and obligation to make my own decision. And the crux of this whole junta fight going on in Washington that John Kennedy knew about when his head was blown off as a message to all other presidents afterwards, do you have a right to make your own decision, or is it made for you? Now, Ronald Reagan traveled in Indiana just before he gave this speech, and the Wall Street Journal noticed that the president even seems capable of wry comments about his own problems. In a recent motorcade through West Bend, Indiana, he spotted a theater marquee announcing one of his old movies. It's called Tennessee's Partner. He turned to those riding with him and recalled with delight that the movie is the only one of his cowboy films in which he is shot and killed in the end, and noted the cinematic demise came when his character stood up for a friend. And this was noted in the Wall Street Journal, as well as the articles about, like the New York Times, the cowboy is dead, the Wall Street Journal saying he's impotent, the editorial the day before talking about Bay of Pigs. I have a right to make my own decisions. Now, when he made the decision about Central America, it turns out that Mr. Calero was being advised by Elliot Abrams and a man named Mr. SORZANO, who took him aside and told him that this is a bitter thing to swallow, but the president is going to support this peace plan. There was an article, again, Miami Herald, Alfonso Shardy, August the 11th, Contras. We were last to hear about the Reagan peace plan, and just before Reagan gave his speech, Mr. SORZANO and Elliot Abrams spoke to Adolfo Calero like you talk to somebody whose member of the family has just died, and they took him aside and they learned of Reagan's plan early in the day before Wednesday's announcement, and not from the Reagan administration. It was Abrams and SORZANO. Now, I mentioned SORZANO a while back. This was in January 5th of 1986. It was broadcast, actually, 1987. It was the first of this year. Broadcast number 787, where Roland Evans and Robert Novak were writing about the National Security Council and the new team. Remember the one where he mentions Fritz Kramer twice? And he said the glimmer of the first silver lining in the cloud darkening President Reagan's presidency is discernible with the new staff at the NSC, the original source of his troubles, where an unexpectedly rich transfusion of blood is raising hopes for preserving Reagan's national security policies. This new staff selection, made by Security Advisor Frank Carlucci, has stunned bureaucracy. Nobody expected him to hire Jose S. SORZANO, a Gene Kirkpatrick protege, and also CIA's Fritz Farmarth, and he's unexpectedly keeping Fritz Kramer, which I mentioned. The environment was shaken up by Carlucci's decision to go for and get SORZANO, who fled Fidel Castro's Cuba after serving and then served Gene Kirkpatrick as UN deputy. He became president of the Cuban American Foundation. It is no mere atmospheric change, and SORZANO is important. The NSC's Latin American policy will be highly regarded by the Foreign Service officer and long-term relationship with the State Department, Frank Carlucci, put in SORZANO. So this very strong man that would keep those Reagan policies is snitching now with Mr. Elliot Abrams, who was not included in the peace plans, and Ronald Reagan's doing motorcades where he sees the sign of where he died, saving a friend, and so forth, and the images are tremendous about the conflicts that are going on. Now, the Wall Street Journal, Bay of Pigs, I'll just cite a few parts of it. It begins, fiasco. There's no other word for it. After 6.5 years in office, the President of the United States has turned over his foreign policy in the Southern Hemisphere to 4 frightened presidents from Central America. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Jim Wright, says the Contras' interests can be represented by the Red Cross. The Reagan-Wright peace plan will go down in history as Ronald Reagan's Bay of Pigs, barring some dramatic event. Just as Cuba was lost when the exile invasion failed, instead of an up or down vote on more aid to the Contras, we now have the Central Americans with an unenforceable peace plan. Presidents, though very attentive to their legacies, and that's a dig because Nancy Reagan wants a legacy, and he's being attentive to the legacy of what he leaves, sometimes miscalculate the judgment of history, and it refers to within 24 hours after the decision to withhold support of the Bay of Pigs invasion, John Kennedy said, "What is prestige? Is it the shadow of power or the substance of power?" Reagan may be in the same process of deluding himself, and Kennedy had said, "No doubt we'll be kicked in the can the next couple of weeks, but that won't affect the main business." And Wall Street Journal editorial says that is a delusion, that Kennedy thought that it would be over in a few weeks. It won't. And it goes on about Reagan's heir apparents, Dole, Kemp, and DuPont, telling the Contras and Bush also they will support them. And then it goes on, after 6.5 years of trusting his own instincts on support for the Contras and building support for the Reagan doctrine, he has inexplicably decided to play by Washington's rules. His managers counted votes for Contra aid on Capitol Hill, threw in the towel before the fight began. He's sitting down and writing his address to the nation this week, and he might consider that all the applause he's hearing is from the other team's fans. Analysts are turning themselves inside out now, trying to explain all the obvious weaknesses in the so-called Guatemala plan cooked up by the Central American presidents. How is it, the analysts wonder, that the plan says nothing about Soviet firepower on Nicaraguan soil? Over the time, this country's allies will mark the results of Ronald Reagan's Bay of Pigs, as it has every other such American fiasco. And it goes into where we have become soft in Vietnam, or with the Shah's successors, and with the Russians and Guatemala plan, and literally says he's lost his rocker, and he is trying to think of his role in history, which is what Nancy wants. And of course, on the other side of the coin is this overweighting amount of articles on drug traffic and evidence and witnesses appearing from San Francisco and Minneapolis and Philadelphia and Florida, all over on the drug traffic of the Contras that we'll be hearing about for a long, long time. As I say, August the 11th, the leader of the Contra movement, Adolfo Calero, was absolutely furious, and he was told, again, I repeat, it's a bitter thing to swallow, but the national security advisors in the State Department had to tell him in advance that Ronald Reagan was going to announce this plan, and they learned of it early that same day, but they had to take it. At least they had to take it for the time being. The Wall Street Journal, August the 12th, had this to say: visibly aged and hurt by the hearings, Reagan tries to rebound as the Iran-Contra hearings go on. He seemed more detached from the process. We're nearing the end of the bloodletting, he said, and the mob has failed in its efforts. Those were his visible words. But having endured periods of sadness, distraction, and pain over the damage to his personal credibility, Reagan is emerging. He feels vindicated and determined, said a lot of his friends, but it's clear he feels hurt by the information he's receiving from a large number of Americans who don't believe that he's telling the truth. The trauma of the past 9 months has taken its toll. The 76-year-old Reagan has aged visibly. He lacks vigor and passion he once displayed. He regularly lapses into long discourses about days as governor of California. Friends say the scandal has been even more discouraging to Nancy, who was by nature nervous and protective of her husband's political image. The president is troubled by many, as I say, the polls. The Wall Street Journal goes on. He has occasionally seemed distracted and detached. In a recent speech in Indianapolis, he misidentified Representative John Myers as Governor Myers before correcting himself. He referred to 1941 when he meant 1981. He lost his place in his prepared text when he was lambasting Congress for approving pork barrel projects. He also is angry and frustrated at his own staff who couldn't find a copy of a 1985 directive characterizing the Iranian arms sales as arms for hostage agreement, and he's visibly upset at the press over the story suggesting he led an effort to conceal the basic facts in the Iran-Contra affair. And the words they use as he makes his speech tonight, some see as his president slipping into impotence, and that speech just came 1 week after he announced the plan that he wanted to have. Now, after he gave the speech, he got on a helicopter, and the circumstances of that I'll rush through very quickly, a composite of some of the stories. This was August the 14th. San Jose Mercury Reagan's helicopter dodges a small plane in Santa Barbara, and the same day on the front page, again, the Nixon era keeps reappearing. John Ehrlichman asked Reagan to pardon his conviction for covering up the Watergate scandal, which wasn't any different, I suppose, than shredding all the papers in the Iran-Contra. You know, it wasn't any different. But the article about the airplane from August the 15th and 16th, I want to share with you. Some of it you've heard, and the symbolism, I think, of the John Wayne Airport is important. If it was leaving from in Orange County coming to Santa Barbara, the word John Wayne wouldn't be so loud, which you can translate as Ollie North or Macho. This incident could have happened lots of places, but it was going towards the John Wayne Airport. A plane heading towards the John Wayne Airport, which is 100 miles south of Santa Barbara, a small plane, was diverted. The pilot who flew near Reagan has lost his license, the FAA license. Ralph Myers, his name is, an Army private who allegedly, according to Fort Myers, was AWOL from Fort Lewis. He strayed unknowingly. He lost his contact lens. That was the first story. And the Secret Service very kindly allowed him to drop out of sight for a while. The plane was rented to Vancouver Aviation, and the passenger on the plane was Harlan Lee Jones, a close friend of his from Oswego, Oregon. Myers was a pilot for Jones, a company called White Salmon in Washington, 1983 to 86, although people in that area can't find out what he did or what the company was. June the 16th, 1986, he was active duty at Fort Lewis, assigned there as a medical specialist, even though he's a pilot, to the 3rd Battalion, 47th Infantry, 9th Motorized Infantry Division. He rented an apartment in Vancouver, 50 miles south of Fort Lewis, for weekend use. He started renting airplanes a month later, and he moved to moved to Oswego, Oregon, to be near Portland, Oregon, near his friend Mr. Jones. As I say, August the 3rd is the date that he failed to appear at the Fort Lewis, but it was 2 weeks before that date that the plans were put in through the NSC, through Chief of Staff Howard Baker and Ronald Reagan, to meet with Speaker Wright, so that there were several weeks' notice about any plans that might happen to scare Reagan, because these people were already making arrangements and working out the proposal that Reagan used if he said he wanted to make his own plans. The FAA listed the home of Myers in Gingen, Washington, not in Lake Oswego, but the Federal Aviation is sending his revoke of license to Oswego. He had several addresses in addition to being full-time in the Army at Fort Lewis, Washington. He was a member of the Nevada Air National Guard from 1980 to 83. This is Mr. Laxalt, Senator Laxalt, Governor Laxalt of Nevada State. He came out of Nevada Air National Guard. He worked as an aircraft mechanic. In 83, he was converted to the Army Reserve. From 1980 to 83, he worked for Reno Flying Service, and some point prior to that, he worked for the Army, employed as a pilot, and then worked for Harlan Jones, as I say. The Ralph Myers, described as the pilot who was supposed to be losing a lens, said actually he didn't lose the lens. He lied about it because nobody would believe what he said. He said, I'm going to get my ass chewed, so I'll tell them my contact's lens fell out. That was August 19th in the newspaper. The first story was one lens fell out, and the other lens fell out, and that's how his plane got off course. They were going to John Wayne Airport, and the limit is 4,000 feet. The pilots are prohibited from flying 4,000 feet within 10-mile range of the Reagan Ranch and 5,000 when the president is there. Myers has several addresses or locations of homes. On the rental application for one apartment, he said he was a flight attendant for PSA, making $1,600 a month, and a flight instructor at Reno Flying Service. The PSA said nobody named William Myers ever worked for them. He was a refueler at the Reno Air Station. The home at Lake Oswego, Oregon, the address that he gave was the address that he used for the Federal Aviation and their mailing, as I say, the revocation of the license there. The newspapers, LA Times and several others, asked what did he do for a living the 3 years he lived in Oswego and worked in the White Salmon Company for Jones. Nobody would say. They said he didn't work an 8-hour job locally. Nobody knows, and that's a good question. What did he do? Harlan Jones was on the way to Orange County to meet Donald Nixon. Harlan Jones sought the Democratic nomination for the 4th District in Oregon in 1986. This is the man who shares apartments and goes flying frequently with Ralph Myers. At the time, he had a firm called VIP Consultants. He operated it out of his house, according to Mr. Bakke, editor of the Enterprise newspaper. Enterprise reminds me of Secord and Hakim wanting to buy, or did buy, property up in Seattle, not far from these particular people in Washington. And, of course, this looks like a dummy front, the VIP Consultants, and even the local newspapers question what the White Salmon Company was or what Jones does. August 16th, there was an article of the Nixon ties to the near-miss accident. Steve Hoffenberg, president of Tower Financial Corporation in Manhattan, a long way away, confirmed that Donald Nixon Jr. is a client of mine. He was meeting with Harlan Jones in Orange County concerning the Jones, Oregon territory. And another article in the Monterey Herald, Donald Nixon's uncle, as you know, President Nixon, is friendly with the president and would certainly want to stay out of the president's airspace. This was not a covert plan against the president, this article said. Both of these men are strong supporters of the president. Donald Nixon would only say that the incident was strictly a pilot error. And while this is going on, this controversy about who's flying over and around Ronald Reagan, Paul Weyrich wrote an article for the LA Herald, a syndicated article, 2 columns. Reagan Revolution is just a paper tiger. Weyrich, a Knight of Malta, one of the founders of Jerry Falwell's church, active supporter of the Contras, has this long article saying the problem is that many conservatives are monarchists at heart. They think that if you own the presidency, that's all you need. And another New York Times article that same date, Central America Peace Plan creates conflict at the White House, and the White House is steaming up. Another article follows August the 17th. These series are from the 17th. The White House is sustaining 2 conflicting positions. This is Wall Street Journal. Sending peace signals about the Wright-Reagan agreement and appeasing the disgruntled conservatives who keep on planning to support the Contras. And regarding Ralph Myers, the pilot of this airplane allegedly went AWOL, he said the person who flew with him, Harlan Lee Jones, says, I do not think that Ralph Myers was AWOL as charged. Myers, an Army private stationed at Fort Lewis, said he didn't believe the AWOL story at all. The Army had to have him arrested to save the military from any further embarrassment. Because of the circumstances of the incident involving the president, it got blown out of proportion. In order to cover their behinds, they filed it right away. This is San Francisco Chronicle. And it continues, Meyer, the pilot, told Jones when he took him on this flight to Orange County, he was on a 6.5-day leave. He signed out August the 30th. He didn't show up. The overflight was August 13th. That would be 10 days. And he said he was on a 6.5-day leave. Meyer said he was allowed to live off the base. On his free time, he took private flight training. He got an honorable discharge from the Air Force, but the dates of that chronology are not given. And the question is, was he in the Air Force the same time General Secord was in the Air Force, or when Frank Carlucci was Deputy Director of the Defense Department from 1981 to 83? And August the 19th, again, Harlan Jones said that he admitted that there was a lie. He told everybody there was a lie about the contact lens, that the pilot, Myers, told him to tell the authorities that the contact lens fell out because and that was the reason why he violated the airspace. And again, he said, I'm going to get my ass chewed, so tell them the contact lens fell out. And Harlan Jones said, it was no big thing for me to tell the press that the contact lens went out. And while this is going on, there are articles of skepticism on the peace plan. Wall Street Journal, August the 17th, U.S. to stress skepticism of this peace plan, and the State Department told their envoys to instruct them that the Reagan administration had little faith that Nicaragua will honor any provisions, and they also gave them copies of the Vietnam Peace Accords, the Paris Peace Accords, and told the heads of the countries in Central America, look what they did in Vietnam. My time is out, and I want to continue with what I believe caused Reagan to make these decisions now and how he is between a rock and a hard place. I hope to continue this with you next week because this is a battle going on in the White House that is very important between Frank Carlucci, the Defense Department, Elliot Abrams, and the team, Mr. Sobranzo, that really run this country, versus Ronald Reagan, who thought he had a right to make the decisions when he wanted to, he and his wife, and what is happening to them as a consequence. The time is out now. I hope to continue with some of this next week. This is Mae Brussell. The program is World Watchers, and save some of your articles on this. It's very important.